Good afternoon from the Iranian Studies Unit of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. My name is Mehran Kamrava. Welcome to the second day of our conference on politics and institutions in Iran. Yesterday, we had three presentations that started with a discussion by Professor Shireen Hunter of the historical context within which the Islamic Republic fits in the broader context of Iranian history. Then we heard from Professor Arang Keshavarzian from NYU, who discussed the nature of protests and the organic relationship between protests by the population on the one hand and the nature of rule by the Islamic Republic on the other. And then we heard from our colleague Ali Reza Eshraghi, who discussed the nature and evolution and economic activities of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So today we will pick up the discussion where we left off yesterday, focusing on two new institutions and revisiting the nature of one of the institutions we discussed earlier. We will lead the discussion with a very distinguished colleague joining us from Berlin, Wilfried Buchta, who is the author of the seminal book and the highly cited book, Who Rules Iran? And Wilfried will start us off by looking at the nature of the Iranian presidency from its inception in 1980 up until today in 2021. After Wilfried Buchta's presentation, we go to Ali Reza Raisi, who is adjunct professor at Northeastern University, who will discuss for us the nature, role, and evolution of the Iranian parliament, which is known as the Majles. And last, but by no means least, we go back to our discussion of the Revolutionary Guards with Amir Mahdavi, who is a PhD scholar at the University of Connecticut, who will continue our discussion of the role and significance of the Revolutionary Guards, or IRGC, in the Iranian political system. So, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Wilfried Buchta. I should just say, sorry, Wilfried, I should just mention that each of our speakers will present for 15 minutes. And then once all three presentations are done, we should have ample time for question and answer. And at that point, we will field questions through social media and through different platforms, including Zoom. So without further ado, Wilfried, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mehran, for this opportunity. Let's start. The presidency, which we know today, has evolved considerably since 1979. Initially, it was a relatively ceremonial position. The new constitution of 1979, it divided leadership of the executive branch between the president and the parliament, president and the prime minister. The president served as a nominal leader of the executive branch, and he was popularly elected for a term of 4 years. However, actual executive power was largely with the prime minister, who was chosen by the majority in the parliament. The assembly of experts that crafted the constitution deliberately divided responsibilities so that a strong and popular elected president would never be able to challenge the authority of the supreme leader. However, friction between president and prime minister appeared unavoidable, particularly when they came from competing ideological factions within the regime's power elite. This was the case very much with Presidents Abul Hassan Bani Sadr in 1980 and Ali Khamenei in 1981 to 1989. When the constitution was revised in 1989, the office of prime minister was abolished, and its responsibilities were assumed by the president. The president is elected every 4 years, and his tenure is limited to serving a maximum of 8 years. As head of government, the president has the authority to appoint and dismiss ambassadors, ministers, and office holders for key economic posts. And in addition to that, through the Minister of Interior, the president appoints the governors of the 31 Iranian provinces. The president and his ministers can be removed only through a 2/3 majority, no confidence vote in parliament. The parliament can also declare the president politically inept or incompetent and inform the supreme leader so that he may remove him in accordance with Article 110 of the Constitution. The president is the second most powerful official in Iran. He signs treaties, he oversees the budget and controls the civilian structures of government responsible for public works, healthcare, electric power, water, and other natural resources. He also derives power from the supreme leader as a person responsible for fulfilling his policies. But his power remains restricted by the authority of the supreme leader, to whom the president is subordinate. And even though the president is elected by the people, the supreme leader must approve his assumption of duties. In addition, it is the supreme leader and not the president who controls the armed forces, the police, and intelligence agencies, and he can declare war and pardon prisoners. Moreover, it is the supreme leader who has the final say on all matters of national security and foreign policy, most notably on Iran's nuclear agreement with foreign powers that is now at risk. The president's role as the system's number 2 is not to be underestimated. The reason is obvious. In the event that the conflict between the two regime leaders end up in open confrontation, the threat of a blockade of the entire system may emerge, or even worse, the system might slip into anarchy and chaos. For that reason, the supreme leader always makes the effort to involve the president in domestic and foreign policy, which shows, for example, in the weekly one-on-one meetings between the two. But as I already indicated, there is permanent tension between the supreme leader and the president. And their relationship is characterized between the poles of cooperation and competition. This started especially after 1989, when Khomeini's death marked the end of an era of charismatic autocracy. After Khomeini came the era of the ascendance of the successor Khamenei as a new supreme leader. As an unimposing compromise candidate chosen by the different wings of the regime's elite, Khamenei had to fight for several years to at least partially overcome those shortcomings. From the very start, he relied on administrative micromanagement and finely meshed control networks. At the beginning, he leaned heavily on the cooperation with Iran's strongman at the time, President Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, the man who had also helped Khamenei's candidacy to victory. Little by little, Khamenei managed to step out of Rafsanjani's overpowering shadow and to win over the most important officers of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and large groups from the conservative camp. Thanks to their help and thanks to the extensive build-up of the Supreme Leader's Office, the Beit Rahbari, Khamenei secured his power as a new Supreme Leader. Gradually, Khamenei's Supreme Leader's Office, which held about 3,000 employees, emerged as the regime's command center since then. Due to the dualism between theocracy and republicanism, each embodied by the supreme leader and by the president respectively, tension and rivalries between the two are unavoidable. Challenged by the presidential attempts to gain more independence, Khamenei was forced to get each of the presidents back in line by putting down his foot during the defining moments of their presidency. The bitter experience of having to bend to Khamenei's will was something all presidents had to go through so far. And that is how Khamenei blocked the path of the moderate Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani 1989 to 1997, and the reformist Mohammad Khatami 1997 to 2005, when they carefully attempted to open up the system to the outside world and liberalize it on the inside. Even the ultra-conservative hardliner Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who followed Khamenei as president in 2005, was eventually checkmated by Khamenei. If one looks today at Iran's institutional architecture of power, one cannot deny that Iran is a hybrid regime made up of a theocratic and a republican element. The reason for that is simple. Since 1980, Iran holds every 4 years popular competitive elections for both the executive and the legislature, and has experienced frequent turnovers in both branches of government, a condition that is completely absent in a pure dictatorship. At the same time, however, it is far away from being a democracy due to the intrusive role of religious authorities that interfere in democratic processes of decision-making. This holds true particularly for the Council of Guardians, which is the strongest bulwark of the conservatives in Iran's power elite, and whose 12 members are directly or indirectly appointed by the supreme leader. Due to its constitutional authority, the Guardian Council is the supreme oversight body, which has the power to assess the qualifications of candidates for parliamentary and presidential elections and can disqualify them according to the principles of ideological loyalty. Over the years, the selection of candidates for presidential elections became more and more rigorous. Despite all that, a few of the candidates belonging to the moderate and reformist factions of the power elite who had a chance to win, they were accepted in elections by the Guardian Council, indicating Khamenei's willingness to allow at least a limited scope of factional competition and ideological pluralism. However, that changed with the recent presidential elections. On June 18, 2021, the regime held presidential elections for the 13th time since 1980. But unlike in all previous elections, the outcome was clear from the start. And Ibrahim Raisi, a conservative hardliner and cleric, could not be denied victory. The reason was that Khamenei had clearly favored Raisi beforehand. This automatically put all of Raisi's rivals from the field of reformers and moderate conservatives at a disadvantage, especially since the Guardian Council had already disqualified all of Raisi's other serious competitors beforehand. Because of this election farce, in which the people were left with hardly any choice, most of the 59 million Iranians eligible to vote decided to boycott the election. It is hardly surprising then that the official voter turnout of 42% was lower than at any time since 1980. As I see it, Raisi's election is a decisive turning point in Iran's history that will shape Iran's domestic and foreign policy development for years to come. His victory can be explained above all by the steadily growing domestic, foreign, and economic pressure that has been building up for years, and that has obviously put the regime elite of the hardliners around Khamenei under so much pressure that they decided in favor of Raisi as a chosen favorite to win for the sake of preserving the system. Some reasons probably tipped the scales. One of the reasons might be Khamenei's realization that it is no longer useful to uphold the facade of Iran as a hybrid system, even though this would mean the de facto abolishment of one of the regime's main pillars of legitimacy, embodied by the popular election of a president every 4 years. Therefore, in order to eliminate once and for all the energy-sapping rivalries and frictions with an executive leader legitimized by popular election, Khamenei decided to merge all the important state institutions, including the presidency and parliament, into a homogeneous governmental apparatus under the leadership of the conservatives. And this apparatus was to be led by a president absolutely devoted to him such as Raisi, who showed not a hint of independence in his 41-year career in the judiciary. In retrospect, it can be seen that Khamenei took the first step toward implementing the strategy in the run-up to the 2020 parliamentary elections, when the Guardian Council, which he controls, disqualified almost all moderates and reformers in the parliamentary election. As a result, the dominance of the conservative hardliners in the legislature was permanently cemented. And with the barely veiled favoring of Raisi in the presidential election of 2021, he consequently took the second step. For the West and the rest of the world, on the other hand, Khamenei's realized strategy is likely to mean the end of a long-held illusion. The dream that reformist-minded, moderate, or other forces, supported by their control of the presidency and parliament, could free themselves from the control and dominance of Khamenei is now finally over. Given Raisi's victory, one should not hope for serious initiatives from inside Iran aiming at the liberalization of the system internally and for any credible political rapprochement to the outside world. And by these words, I would like to finish my presentation. And I think I've kept myself in the time limits. And yes, now I'm open for
Thank you so much.
questions.
Thank you so much. That was excellent and a very thorough discussion of the evolution of the presidency. And thank you again for keeping within the time limit. Professor Raisi, return to you now for a discussion of the Majles. The floor is yours.
Sure, thank you. Thank you everybody for coming, and a special thanks to Dr. Mehran Kamrava for organizing this wonderful event. So my talk today is about the parliament, or what we call it Majles, in Iran's political discussion. So as you know, Majles is one of the most important elected institution in the structure of Islamic Republic. And even comparing with the other electoral authoritarian regime, Majles play a very important role. It's a very effective institution, especially in the post-Khomeini era. So what I'm gonna do is basically reviewing some of the most important historical events in the history of Iranian parliament, because that's very important to understand what's going on right now. And then I'll talk about the role of the Majles and the recent development that we observe in the role of the Majles. So as I said, Majles is a very important institution. In addition to major role of the other parliament, which is the legislation and oversight, Majles also play two important roles in the Islamic Republic. First of all, it basically channels the factional shift inside the political regime in Iran, and also it play a very important role in the citizen-politician linkage, which I'll talk about it in a moment. So if you look at the role and the composition of the Majles, we observe a very important characteristic. In some sense, it's unique to the Iranian parliament, but we observe similar pattern in the other electoral authoritarian regime, which is basically a fundamental disparity between the parliamentary politics of the center versus periphery, or the metropolitan areas versus the local district. So if you look at the metropolitan areas, most of the members of the parliament, or MPs, are elected by the factional endorsement. But on the other hand, if you look at the local areas and the provincial district, most of the members of the parliament heavily influenced by the daily demands, or what I call it, the particularistic demands of the citizen in local areas. If we want to understand this pattern of disparity, we have to look at the historical evolution of the role of the Majles, and especially what happened since Iran's constitutional revolution in 1905. And right after the constitutional revolution, there was some requirement for people to vote, especially they should all adult, male, educated, they should have some property requirement. And then But after 1911, the suffrage extended the voting right to all adult male Iranians. So that was perhaps the most important development in the parliamentary politics of Iran, because before 1911, the Majles, or the parliament, mostly controlled by the intellectuals, even though they were a minority in the Iranian parliament, but they had the ability to set the agenda. But after 1911, the landlord gradually dominated the Iranian parliament, and it was mostly because that they had absolute control over the local areas of Iran, and they could hurt the peasant like the cattle, and then they send them to the voting station, and eventually they dominated the parliament. And they had, most of the time, with few exceptions, they had in favor of the conservative forces in Iranian politics. And that continued, and we don't have time to discuss it, but we can even discuss how this phenomena impacted the ouster of the Prime Minister Mossadegh in 1953, because at that time the parliament was in favor of the conservative forces, and he had difficulty in dealing with the parliament. And that was the reason that he dissolved the parliament, and then subsequently we had a coup in Iraq. But after that, it continued until the land reform in 1963. And the land reform basically had a very important role in Iranian society, and especially it also influenced Iran's parliamentary politics, because the landlord, the power of the landlord gradually diminished, and the local bureaucracies basically had the same role in the daily lives of the citizen, and they could play a very important role in Iran's parliamentary politics. We can observe that in the post-revolutionary pattern of parliamentary politics. In one of my other research, I showed how the local bureaucracies and also the post-revolutionary welfare organization and bureaucracies influenced the pattern of political participation in local areas, and especially in the parliamentary politics. So this is the root cause of the problem that we observe, that we have the local parliamentary politics is influenced by the daily demands of the citizens, what I call it the particularistic demands about the daily lives. Mostly, it's different from clientelism that you hear in the literature of the parliamentary politics in the Middle East and North Africa, but they had some overlap in terms of the daily local demands of the citizens. So in general, instead of the landlord, we observe that local bureaucracies influence the daily lives of the citizen, and consequently the local parliamentary politics. So this is what we observe in the local parliamentary politics, but at the metropolitan areas, or what we call it the center, we observe a different pattern in the parliamentary politics. As I said, we observe that the factional politics play a very important role in parliamentary politics. Dr. Bukhtar did a great job of analyzing the role of factional politics. I'm not going to repeat that, but in general, we observe that, for example, the factional debates are dominant. Factional debates in the Iran's political sphere is dominant in the center, and especially in the parliament, because of the members of a parliament from the center. For example, at the first Majles, at the beginning of the Islamic Republic, there was a fight between the inside the revolutionaries to oust the Prime Minister the President Banisad. And then after that, because of the heterogeneous nature of the ruling elite, we observed that the revolutionaries, who were the followers of Ayatollah Khomeini, also had some conflict. And we can observe that in the second and the third Majlis, it was mostly over the interpretation of the Sharia law. It was over how, for example, the leftist revolutionary had a leftist interpretation of the Sharia law. On the other hand, the traditionalists tried to basically implement the Sharia law as is, or as it has been cited in the textbook of the Shia jurisprudence. So, but after removing the leftists from the parliament in the fourth parliament, we can observe the same conflict inside the proponent of Hashemi Rafsanjani, because there was a fight between for example, the pro-market reform forces of the Rafsanjani and also the leftist. And then after that, we can observe that this fight continues. And as I said, the heterogeneous nature of the ruling elite play a very important role. And I'm not going to repeat what happened after that because Dr. Gupta did a great job of analyzing the factional debates. So what I'm going to do is basically talking a little bit about the role of and the correlation that we observe between the factional shift in the presidential election and the factional shift inside the parliamentary politics. So after the victory of President Khatami, reformists also won the 6th Majles with the overwhelming majority. And we observe the same pattern that because after each of the presidential election, we have a shift in the factional politics of the Majles, and generally the winning faction in the presidential election being the parliamentary election as well. So we can explain that in terms of the percentage of the winning, the vote for the winning faction. I can talk about it in Q&A on how we can show that basically quantitatively. But also I want to talk a little bit about the reform of the Majles. There was a long discussion that this composition of the Majlis is not effective because the local parliamentarian or the members of the parliament, they have to spend a lot of time on the daily demands of the citizens. And they don't have time to spend on the programmatic policy making or what generally we do, the general policies of the country. Because of that, many members of the parliament realize that this setting is not effective. So the most important plan to reform the Majlis role was the provincialization of the Majlis, or what generally they call it طرح استانی شدن انتخابات. Instead of selecting one member of for each of the district, they have to select parliamentarian or the members of the parliament for the entire province. So that's basically cut off the connection, the personal connection between the MPs and the citizens. But the Guardian Council vetoed this legislation, and also after the 6th Majlis, reformists initiated this plan. But also the conservative, also after working for a few years, they realized that this setting doesn't work. And because of that, they also tried to do the similar legislation, but all of them vetoed by the Guardian Council. So at the end, I want to talk a little bit about the recent development that we observe in the role of the Majlis, because we observed that we had a little bit of decline in the role of Majlis. We are not sure that this is going to continue or not, because this is evolving. This is an ongoing process. Expediency Council or Majmع تشخیص مصلحت is one of the most important institution in undermining the role of the Majlis because of the new interpretation of the Iranian constitution, that they argue that because that's in the constitution of Iran, that the supreme leader basically determines the general policies of the Islamic Republic. But they added a new board in the Expediency Council that they can basically veto Majlis legislation based on the contradiction with the general policies determined by the Supreme Leader of Iran. So that's a new interpretation, and there is a lot of fight, not just between the reformist or the moderate and the Expediency Council. Also, the conservative are unhappy with this problem and undermining the role of the Majlis. Again, this is evolving. We don't know what's going to happen at the end. And also, we have a new institution, a council for the coordination of the head of the 3 branches of the government. And they had also some interference with the role of the Majlis, especially in the annual budget. According to the Iranian constitution, the annual budget must be approved by the parliament, but they did some they made some important decisions, especially about the price of gas and the currency exchange rate. And they limited the role of the Majlis. And we have also another legislation about the oversight on the role, on the performance of the MPs, which happens in the 9th Majlis after the victory of the conservative. And finally, the role of the informal network, which is understandably really hard to measure or talk about that, but that play a very important role in undermining and limiting the role of the parliamentarians. And these are the recent development. As I said, again, we are not 100% sure that we can observe it for the future. It could be because of the special circumstances of a withdrawal of the Donald Trump from JCPOA that basically put enormous pressure on the Iranian economy. And the Iranian leader came up with new way of policy making. So that could be because of that, but we have to wait and see if that's gonna continue or not. So I'm gonna stop here. And thank you very much. We can talk about the details in the Q&A.
Alireza, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. That was an excellent discussion of the very complex institution of the Majles, and particularly the way that some of its powers have been reduced and constrained in the last decade or so. We now turn to Amir Mahdavi and a discussion of the role of the IRGC in the political process. Amir, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Professor Kamrava, for having me in this very interesting panel discussion. Actually, I like the way that you put this three presentation in order: presidency, parliament, and at the end, the Revolutionary Guard is going to take over all the other branches. So actually, it doesn't require much of insight to realize that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC or Seppa, is extensively involved in every aspect of Iran politics. Therefore, scholarship on Iran's public affairs, politics, and cultural should be addressed the role of IRGC. So I am not going to try to demonstrate the salience of the IRGC's role, but instead will briefly trace the roots of its current significance through an examination of historical context. In following, I'm going to review the IRGC's 8 points of strength that are driven by events that allowed the organization to intervene in different political dimensions, suggesting that the IRGC is not merely the product of Iran leadership decision to expand its influence, but it is the product of the historical context. First, I am going to start with regional politics. The Seppa's regional activities have become the principal variable affecting Iran's relation with the international community. Even shortly after Iran was allowed to resolve its nuclear issue, the United States withdrew from the agreement by renegotiating a set of issues mainly related to the Seppa's regional activities. Although the role of Seppa's proxies in the Middle East gained attention through news coverage following the overthrow of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and particularly since the Arab Spring when the IRGC found its way to Syrian civil war, the main pillars of its intervention were established 3 decades ago. Iraq's strike on Iran in 1980, for which the Seppa was involved in securing the Islamic Republic's control around the country, became an invitation for a relatively small organization, then in its infancy, to expand its influence abroad. The founders of Seppa were young revolutionaries whose commander-in-chief was only 27, who successfully changed Iran monarchy by mobilizing people around the universal movement of oppressed people. They were inspired by Arab guerrilla groups whom considered the masters of resistance in the region. Before 1979 revolution, in addition to organized relationships among several Iranian leftist and Islamist groups and the Fatah movement, many of the revolutionaries received military training in Palestine, which is why the Office of Freedom Movement was one of the first divisions of Seppa established to maintain relationship with revolutionary groups throughout the Middle East. This segment of Seppa began to cooperate with the Amal movement, Lebanon's Shia groups, and Libya's leader Buffy, who was passionate about the Islamic Revolution occurring in Iran. These relationships allowed Seppa to take its first step toward engaging in actions in the MENA region, even before the 8-year-long war with Iraq. However, war with Iraq created an opportunity for Seppa to fulfill their beyond border ambitions, which they could frame as a way to free Palestine. Linking war with Iraq to the Israel-Palestine conflict not only provided them with an ideological rationale they could use to recruit revolutionary veterans, but also became a way for Seppa to establish a new front in regional relations to identify Arab partners, which was essential for resisting Saddam. I will enumerate two dynamics in the following points that were rooted in the war but continue today. First, war provided a platform to activate the protest capacities of Iraq's Shia majorities who had been suppressed by Ba'ath Party. Many communication channels between seminaries of in Iran and Najaf in Iraq resumes after the war, and political groups such as Dawah Party and the Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq, Majles A'la, began to engage in visible cooperation with Seppa. Gradually, the Shia Iraqi prisoners of war provided leverage for Seppa to expand its network in Iraq, and they were a significant source of information for Seppa as well. The Badr division of Seppa was composed of later Iraqi figures such as Abu Mahdi Mohandes and Ibrahim Amiri, who is in charge of Hashd al-Shabi right now, and a future Iranian ambassador to Baghdad. Likewise, the Ramazan military base was founded through the contribution of Kurdish leaders such as Barzani and Talabani with Seppa against Saddam. The current second in command of Seppa and the current Iran ambassador in Baghdad both were affiliated with this base during the 8-year war with Iraq. The second line I want to mention here is that the war also creates a new chapter in Iran-Syria relations that was allied with Hafez al-Assad regime's interest in cooperating with a new anti-Israel regional power, while Syrian territories were occupied by Israel. Syria also needed help supporting its allies in Lebanon. Additionally, the two Ba'ath parties of Iraq and Syria had a rivalry with each other. Therefore, Syria was working with Seppa to undermine its neighborhood adversary. These two rationales created a space for cooperation Syrian government and Seppa. This included selling missiles to Seppa when Iran was under an armament embargo, and training Seppa engineers, including who was later considered as the father of Seppa's missile program. Even the Syrian army functioned as a proxy for Iranian military purchases from European countries. Also, Hafez al-Assad designated a section of the Damascus International Airport to be used by Seppa as a hub for distribution of weaponry to southern Lebanon and Iranian battlefields. The Syrian border was the Seppa's only access point to supplying Hezbollah in Lebanon with weapons. So we see that this kind of military relation with southern Lebanon through Syria was rooted in developments of 1980s and the war. The next area I want to cover here is Seppa's historical role in contemporary Iranian economic. Although its exact share in the Iranian economy is a topic of ongoing debate, it is obvious that the only stakeholder whose role in designing economic policy and owning businesses and construction firms that is comparable with the administration, i.e. The executive branch, is Seppa. First, military engaging was an essential part of Sepah's job in the more than 1,500 kilometers of battlefield on the Iran-Iraq border during the war. Performing these functions required huge investment in the military industry and the recruitment of corps of engineers. This mission strengthens and enabled Sepah in civil engineering and implementing large-scale construction projects. Also, due to emergency of war, Sepah was allowed to take over every manufacture and use industries for supplying battlefield. That gives a great learning and try and fail opportunity to Sepah. The second economic related advantage of war for Sepah was that the constant need for obtaining armament from abroad necessitated learning international trade skills such as negotiation, banking, financing, trade, shipment, and navigating the global system by Sepah. Iran's isolation during the war and tacit embargoes granted Sepah its first experience in circumventing trade sanctions, underground financing, and trafficking of goods. Later on, this activated many capacities, especially in the Middle East, that became instrumental in Sepah's economic activities throughout the region. Finally, Sepah acquired administrative competence for economic planning and management during the war. In the structure of Iran administration during the war, Sepah had its own ministry as a part of the executive branch that was responsible for the logistic of its forces. So that again gave a great opportunity for learning and try and fail to youth revolutionary corps to educate themselves in budgeting, planning, negotiating for budget, and so on, and other administrative skills. Now, after laying out the deep effects of the war on the regional and economic expansion of Sepah, I would like to review 3 post-war factors that contributed to the increasing role of Sepah in domestic politics. After the 8 years of war, thousands of Sepah's ideology-driven volunteer troops were disheartened by the ceasefire with Iraq in the year of 1988. These youth veterans were recruited with the hope of liberating the holy city of Karbala in Iraq. After ceasefire, they faced a termination of war without achieving those kind of promises. While the country was undergoing massive reconstruction, they returned to their hometowns without capital, education, or skills required to compete with their peers. A new force for cultural repression and imposition of Sepah's revolutionary ideology was born from the conflict between normalization and reconstruction pursued by the government after the war in one side, and the melancholy and frustration of Sepah's volunteer troops who had no constructive agenda after the war on the other side. This led to the wave of returning to the revolutionary values we saw in many movies, media outlets, and political faction operated by this group of veterans after the war. The second dynamic was that as a result of termination of the war, Sepah needed to define its position and bureaucracy to place its forces. In addition to establishing a military rank system for the first time since Sepah was founded, many of its affiliates were transformed to other organizations to function as a network of regime loyalists throughout the government. They were placed in education system as religious mentors, in broadcasting organization, and in the electoral process to examine the loyalty of candidates. These trends shifted the capacity of these corps to soft war with domestic threats instead of fighting enemies in the war. And the last but not least important trend was that the committees of Islamic Revolution that were dissolved in the police organization in the aftermath of war. Committee of Islamic Revolution was the organization and armed force in charge of security in urban areas. As a result of this dissolve, many of its tasks were assigned to Seppa. So Seppa started flexing its muscle to control cities. This was a beginning point for developing Seppa capacities in anti-protest mission, as well as the monitoring and prosecuting of civilians for so-called security charges. And they were later utilized in suppressing mass uprisings such as 2009 Green Movement and 2019 nationwide protests. According to the time, actually, I would prefer to stop here and explain more on each point in Q&A part. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. You did a brilliant job at walking us through the evolution of the Seppa's political and economic activism since the war. We have a number of questions that have come to us. Let me just mention that our audiences can submit questions through our various social media platforms or through the chat function here on Zoom, and those questions will come to me. I ask that the questions be kept very concise and to the point, and I ask our discussants to please keep their responses also concise so that we can get through all of them. We have a number of questions already. Wilfred, I'll start with you. There's a question on whether the Rafsanjani presidency was the last time we saw an executive presidency. And now that Khamenei has overshadowed the institution of the presidency and has overcome his own lack of confidence in the office of the Velayat-e-Faqih, are we ever likely to see another strong presidency, or are they going to be undermined constantly? Wilfred, your microphone is off.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead, please.
I think this remark is quite correct. We can consider the Rafsanjani presidency as the last tenure of an elected president who has really wielded power in a sufficient and far-reaching way. Up to now, we have seen that the powers and I would say the authority of every president who followed Rafsanjani since then, that means Khatami, Ahmadinejad and Khatami, their authority has been reduced. Their wings have been clipped by Khamenei, and I think this is a tendency which is ongoing. And I don't see that in the future or in the foreseeable future any chance that anytime soon a president can emerge which will be able to enlarge his scope or his elbow room so far that he can challenge the dominance of the supreme leader. And with regard to the current president, Mr. Raisi, as it is quite obvious, he was groomed by Khamenei because he is very pliable, he is obedient to him 100%, and probably he is also groomed as his successor for being supreme leader after his demise. And that's why I'm a little bit pessimistic that we see a kind of repowering of the office of the presidency so far. And I think the element of republicanism in the Iranian system has been in permanent decline. And I think there is no indications that this trend can be reversed.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you. Professor Raisi, we know that parliaments are meant to perform certain functions. They perform functions of elite recruitment, of representation, and in some ways the Majles has succeeded in providing a forum for discussion. We see that many of the politicians start their careers in the Majles. Rouhani, for example, Khamenei, almost all of them have started their parliament. So it has been a very useful forum for elite recruitment. But does the Majlis perform any function whatsoever in legitimizing the political system? Does it, in that critical role of legitimation, does the Majlis perform that or no?
That's a very good question, actually. As I explained, if you look at the disparity that we observe between the center and periphery, we can, if you look at the turnout rate, we can see that the turnout in the peripheries or the provincial district, it's substantially higher than the turnout in the metropolitan areas. So in that sense, yes, we can say that it basically legitimized the political system, especially in the local areas, because the members of the parliament can directly address the daily needs of the citizen in those areas. But in terms of what we observe in the metropolitan district, it's a little bit different. We see that in some of the elections, the turnout rate is high. In some of the elections, turnout rate is low. It mostly depends on the way that the members of the parliament or the faction try to address the demands of the metropolitan citizen, which is mostly, we can call it the middle class demands. It's a very shaky or tenuous word, that what is the middle class in Iran, what are their demands. But obviously the Majlis legitimized the Iranian political system, at least in the peripheries. But for the center or the metropolitan areas, it's a very difficult discussion to decide about which of the Majlis, the turnout rate, and how, for example, these factions could actually address the demands of the metropolitan citizens. So that's a very short answer. I'm not sure if we need to continue that or because that's difficult, as I said, to talk about the role of the Majlis in the metropolitan areas. We also have another elected institution, the city council. That's a very important, and that's a very difficult, much more difficult to study the role and the impact and the composition of the city council and how they interact in the metropolitan areas with the Majlis. So that's a short answer to the question, which is a great question.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Amir, we just heard Wilfred discuss the position of the presidency. And we know that, for example, according to the 1979 Constitution, there was a deliberately weak presidency. And then in the 1989 revisions of the Constitution, in theory, at least, there was an executive presidency, which in practice has become weakened because of the rise in influence and dominance of the office of the supreme leader. And as Wilfred mentioned, this current president is particularly pliant. In fact, we see that he has presented a list of potential cabinet appointees to the Majlis, and almost all of them come from Ahmadinejad cabinet, Ahmadinejad administration. And we know that Ahmadinejad drew most of his cabinet from former IRGC or Revolutionary Guards figures. So are we likely to see an even greater influence of the IRGC in the Raisi presidency, particularly as we see in his cabinet nominations?
I think that we must view and analyze the victory of Raisi in the last presidential elections in the framework or in the context of a big and permanent shift of power inside the balance of political forces inside Iran. I think that the time of the moderates or the moderate conservatives and the reformists or the so-called pragmatists, that means the followers and aides of former President Rafsanjani, the end, I think that, that these forces have been exhausted. I think that these forces, that means the reformist camp, the moderate conservative camp members and members of the so-called pragmatists, the Korgozaran of former President Rafsanjani, their time is over. Now, one big faction, that means the conservative camp, including the mainstream conservatives and the hardliners, they dominate the political scenery in Iran. And this is not, I would say, a phenomenon that will change so easily. I think what we can see is that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps is made up of members of the hardcore radical faction of the conservative camp, and their political power is growing more and more. And I think this trend will be stabilized now. And it can be seen by the appointment of so many former members of the Seppa, of the IRGC in Raisi's presidency. And I think that the time of the moderates, the reformists, and the pragmatists is over.
Thank you. Thank you. Amir, would you like to add anything to that?
Yes, actually, that was a very interesting question. First of all, according to the history of the presidency in Iran, especially after war, and even before that, the history of executive branch, it would be more precise title for this issue. In the last three decades, the Ahmadinejad, 8 years of Ahmadinejad was the only opportunity for what we call right now as principalists to actually engage in executive branch and elevate themselves to the level of minister or governor of provinces. So I believe any principalist presidents, Raisi or anybody else who could be the president and who could be the peak of the supreme leader's office for this term of presidency, had no other option to use a lot of executives who were affiliated with Ahmadinejad's government in many other levels. And I believe that we will see this kind of wave and trend in appointing the undersecretaries, deputies, governors, so on. There are more than 2,000 like so-called political seats that should be filled in the next 3 months. Another topic of another element of your question is using people who have background in Revolutionary Guard. Actually, Revolutionary Guard always functions as the alumni club of Revolutionary Guard functions as a good pool for selecting executives for a different position in the Islamic Republic. Even people, even many ministers who were affiliated with the moderate and reformist administrations of Rafsanjani, Khatami, and Rouhani had experience in Revolutionary Guard. But this time, I would say yes. Of course, we hadn't seen this kind of coherent and unified campaigning of all of the Revolutionary Guards division and all of the factions within Revolutionary Guards behind one presidential candidates. None of them were comparable with the Raisi's campaigns, either in 2016 or 2017 or 2021. So yes, we can expect the most share of foreign revolutionary guards affiliate in this government, but it doesn't mean that all of them are coming from the same political faction or same political view. We are seeing the challenge and conflict between different political blocs within Revolutionary Guard and even within the Office of Supreme Leader itself. And this cabinet, this 18 individuals, or this list is a product of those challenges and those interactions.
Thank you. Ali Reza, you mentioned city councils and the importance of municipal elections. There is a question that someone has asked as to whether these municipal elections and the fact that Iranian politics really, in some ways, pays attention to the grassroots. Can these be a motor or an engine for some sort of democracy within the system, at least at the grassroots level?
I am not optimistic on that sentence, because what we observe after holding 5 city council election and basically running for 5 times, it started by the reformists in 2000. What we observe is mostly a pattern of clientelism and corruption in the city municipalities instead of democratic representation. So I'm not saying that it has no effect on the democracy building in Iran, but we should be aware that also it could be a source of corruption and clientelism. And I would say that that's a very good question for the future studies. We don't have a comprehensive studies of the city council, but I am a little bit pessimistic about the democratic role of the city council and the municipalities. What we observe, there are some public reports about the corruption that happens, for example, in Tehran municipality. And that's huge. That's unbelievable how, for example, they try to appoint the members of their faction inside the different position inside the municipality, how they basically use the resources in the municipality. And that was one of the most important sources of conflict between the moderate faction in the past term of the Tehran City Council and the conservative. So I would say that we should be aware of the problem of corruption and clientelism. So I think it's, instead of a grassroots bottom-up building of democracy, could be a source of clientelism and corruption. And that's very important to consider. What are the root causes of the corruption that we observe here? Is it the lack of other institution? Is it the big institution in Iran that cannot prevent corruption? Or is it something else about the lack of political parties in Iran? Because instead of having a unified process of decision-making, offering programs to the constituencies, it's mostly the factions that try to work with each other and basically just hold the seats inside the city council and the municipalities.
Thank you so much. There is a question that has come to us on the effects of developments in Afghanistan on Iran. We know, for example, that Raisi, either today or yesterday, said that, quote, America's defeat presents an opportunity for regional peace. Would any of you care to comment on how developments inside Afghanistan are likely to influence domestic politics in Iran? As an aside, we know that, for example, Raisi has tasked outgoing Foreign Minister Zarif to overlook the Afghan file for now.
When I'm allowed to make a short remark, I think this statement of Raisi is a clear sign of his incompetence. I think that, as we all know, he is a man who has risen through the ranks of judiciary, and he has a very limited amount of education in secular, non-religious affairs, and his knowledge is limited from all different angles, wherever you look at him. And he doesn't know what he's talking about. I think it's just the opposite. The development in Afghanistan is a source of concern for all Iranians, because it is quite obvious that there will be resistance within Afghanistan in the next months to come from within against the Taliban rule. And this can lead either to a new ignition of a kind of civil war, or it can even give rise to a massive migration moves from hundred thousands of Afghanis who are fleeing the country. And most of them will not go to Pakistan. Most of them will try to find shelter in either Iran or in Turkey, or they may hope that they can move to Europe. And that means Iran is in danger. And I think the remark of Mr. Raisi shows his incapability of understanding what is really going on in regional affairs.
Okay, thank you. Amir and Ali Reza, if either of you would like to add to that, let me just add there's a related question on the nature of US-Iran relations under a Raisi presidency. I should add that tomorrow we have a session devoted, a presentation devoted to Iranian foreign policy. But would either of you care to comment, in addition to what Wilfried just said, on either developments in Afghanistan or Raisi, what a Raisi presidency could mean for US-Iranian relations?
Can I talk? Yeah, briefly. I am sure that Dr. Raisi would provide you with better answer about the Iran-US relationship. I just want to mention two brief points that it is, of course, too early to make any comprehensive judgment about the impact of the progress of Taliban in Afghanistan on Iranian domestic and foreign politics. But what I can say through my observation in the recent week, I can see, first of all, again, that reminds me of the emerging of Daesh couple years ago. Every security emergency situation that happened around Iran and in the border of Iran, Daesh was in the western border and not Taliban in the eastern border, of course, would give some sort of leverage to the organization and institutions and factions who are in charge of security matters. So I can see that the armed forces, namely Revolutionary Guard, who is responsible for the security of the eastern part of the country, would gain this kind of leverage and would have can utilize this advantage of maintaining security of borders in domestic politics as well. And I can see a starting point of a wave of discreditation of the people and factions who are called by the supreme leader and the principalists as pro-West people, who were more optimistic about the impact of engaging with the United States and the West on the domestic politics, on human rights, and so on. So with observing what Taliban is going to do with human rights or women rights or this kind of issue in Afghanistan, I think that would give a disadvantage to the factions in Iran who were seeking democracy and more engagement with the West and international community at the same time.
Thank you. I should just mention for benefit of audience that you have no relation. We've been talking a lot about President Raisi. Our own Professor Raisi has no relationship with President Raisi, but still you get the last word of the evening. Please go ahead with your remarks.
I think his actual surname is Raisu Sadat, so it's known as Raisi, so it's different. I just want to add something to what Amir and Wilfred said, that what we observe from the cabinet member that Raisi proposed to the Majles, it can say a little bit about their general foreign policy approach. Amir Abdullahian, the foreign minister that he introduced to Majles, it's not as hardliner as the right side of the spectrum among the conservative, because if you look at, for example, other suggestion for the foreign minister of Raisi was Bagheri Kani and Said Jalili. So Amir Abdullahian is more pragmatic in that sense. So in terms of the foreign policy of the Iran, I would say that we probably observe some sort of pragmatist understanding of the principalist faction in Iran. So they are still principalists. They are not reformists. They are not moderate, but they are not in the hard side of the spectrum of the principalists. So, because originally some part of the hardliners or the known as Paidari front, Cephe Paidari, they were interested to have somebody like Bagheri Kani or Said Jalili as the foreign minister. But right now we have Amir Abdullahian, which is a diplomat and also more pragmatist inside the principalists. So that's just looking at the cabinet member, we can observe that that we should expect more pragmatic approach inside the principalist agenda of the foreign policy.
Thank you very much. My sincere thanks to all three of our presenters and to our audiences around the world. Tomorrow, we continue the discussion by looking at the foreign policy establishment. We will also have a discussion on elections and also on the role and changes within the Iranian judiciary. Two of our presenters tomorrow will be joining us from Australia, and so our timing is a little different in order to accommodate our Australian participants. We will start at 10 a.m. Doha time, which would be 7 a.m. GMT and 3 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time in the US. We look forward to seeing as many of you as possible. My sincere thanks to our presenters today and to everybody, to the team in the background that has made all this possible, and look forward to seeing you again very soon. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.